She dressed in silence, always leaving through the back door and returning before the sun threatened to rise. The city slept while her heart was on fire, caught between what she felt and what she deserved. He was a millionaire, accustomed to buying everything except peace of mind. And she knew was just the woman who cleaned his mirrors and, without meaning to, began to reflect in him everything he didn't want to see. In the cold corridors of that mansion, there were encounters of warm bodies, forbidden kisses and looks that screamed what mouths could never say. But at some point, what was desire became burden. She wanted respect. He offered silence. And one morning, when the clock struck 3:33, she didn't open the door anymore. And only then did he realize how hard it was to love someone who was never bought. What began as an escape became the center of a hurricane. He sought her with the desperation of someone who has lost more than a secret. He has lost the only truth that still made sense in the midst of his life of appearances. The employees whispered, his friends laughed, and the tabloids speculated. But no one knew that. While he signed million-dollar contracts, he was thinking about her rough hands holding his shirt, about the sweet words she let slip even when she tried to be tough, and about the pain she carried in her eyes every time she was reminded of her place. Now, with his heart in pieces and the house in silence, he was only certain of one thing. When love asks for respect and doesn't receive it, it doesn't go away. It dies, and sometimes it dies too late. If you feel that this story has something to say to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and come with us, because what is to come may speak directly to your heart. She arrived before the others, well before sunrise. She opened the back door of the mansion, put on her headphones with old music, and began the day cleaning up the luxurious footprints of a family that would never know her name. The cold marble, the huge windows, the hallways smelling of expensive perfume, everything testified to the silence of a woman who carried in her eyes a story that no one asked about. Her name was Eleanor, and she had worked there for 4 years. She was never late, never complained, and never looked her boss in the eye. But as soon as he started looking into hers, everything changed. Alexander Harrington, heir to a real estate fortune, was the typical man who had everything except peace and quiet. He wore a suit even indoors and was always surrounded by commitments that didn't matter. But one day, in the middle of the night, he went down to get a drink of water and saw her there, on her knees, cleaning the floor with her calloused hands. She was startled. He was enchanted, and from that moment on, what was invisible became desire. The quick conversations began, the silent coffees she left on the counter, the hidden glances at the security cameras he began to review more often than he would admit. It was dangerous, it was wrong, but it was real. When everyone else went to sleep, they woke up to exist in each other. She felt ashamed of wanting someone who hid her, but his body sought her with a hunger she had never felt before. In the first few months, she fooled herself into thinking that this was love, that one day he would introduce her to his friends, his mother, the world. But his world was made of appearances and expensive dinners where she would never have a place. Still, she accepted crumbs, thinking it was a banquet, because it was that or nothing, and she had lived long enough to know that sometimes almost is the only shelter for those who never had a choice. Time passed. The encounters became a hidden routine, and her heart began to weigh heavy. She wanted to be loved, not just desired. But how could she demand respect from someone who didn't even have the courage to hold her hand outside the bedroom? Her friends at work were suspicious but said nothing. The driver looked at her with pity, and her eyes, increasingly tired, asked for help without words. He said he loved her, but always added, "It's not time yet. I can't yet." People wouldn't understand. Until the day she understood that those who love don't need permission to love, and the silence that used to be a bridge became an abyss. That morning, while he slept with his cell phone turned off next to another glass of wine, she went downstairs for the last time, without leaving a note, without drama, only pain, and the decision to choose herself, even if it was too late. At first, he didn't notice her absence as he should have. He thought it was just a delay, maybe a cold, or some household problem that would soon be resolved. But that morning, When he went downstairs and saw the kitchen still cold, without the aroma of the coffee she always left ready, a strange restlessness ran through his body. He ignored it. He sat down to read his emails, had meetings, and tried to keep up with the pace his routine demanded. But when he walked through the hall and saw the foggy mirror, he remembered how she always cleaned it with a smile, saying that it wasn't the mirror that reflected dirt, but the heart of the person looking at it. The sentence seemed silly at the time, but in that moment it felt like a stab in the back. The next day, she didn't show up either, and the day after that. She sent a message. 2. Nothing. He decided to call. The number was out of range. The driver, who knew more than he was letting on, gave him a judgmental look when Alexander asked if he knew anything. "Sometimes, sir, people get tired of waiting for what never comes." He didn't answer, but the sentence stuck. On the third day, he began to relive the moments, the early mornings when she waited for him in silence, with a blanket over her shoulders and a mug in her hands, the way she picked up his scattered clothes without complaining, her low voice whispering secrets that only the two of them knew, and above all her eyes, those eyes that no longer asked for love, they begged for respect. And he never gave it. He gave pleasure, he gave vague promises, he gave half-hearted presents. But he never gave her what she wanted most, a place. He thought of her with a mixture of longing and guilt, but he still tried to rationalize. She was just an employee, he told himself, just someone who passed by. But when night fell and the room remained dark, it was impossible to lie. The space she occupied inside him now screamed in emptiness. That was when he decided to look for her, not by phone, not by text message, but with his body, with his will. He got in the car and drove to the neighborhood where he knew she lived. He hoped she would see him and get emotional, that everything would be resolved with a hug, an apology, a new beginning. But the door to the house was closed. The windows were closed too. None of the neighbors knew about her, or they pretended not to know. The only clue was a dry plant on the porch with a crumpled note between the branches. When the root dies, there's no point in watering the leaves. He understood. Too late, perhaps. But he understood. He felt his chest sink. He went back home and opened a bottle of wine. He sat down in the dark, and for the first time in his life, he cried for someone that money couldn't bring back. The first time they were together, it wasn't planned. The night was, colder than usual, and she had stayed up late cleaning the floor of the main hall because there was a business meeting the next day. He came downstairs with a half-open bottle of wine in his hand, wearing only a loose dress shirt and bare feet. He found her on her knees, scrubbing hard at an invisible stain. She didn't see him approach. When she did, she jumped up, her face flushed with embarrassment, her uniform dirty, her hair disheveled. But he smiled. Not cynically, like he did at corporate dinners. It was almost a childish smile, shy, as if he were faced with something he couldn't name. He asked her if she wanted some wine. She hesitated. She said it wasn't right, that she was an employee. But he insisted. They sat on the cold floor of the empty room and shared what was left in the bottle. The words came loosely, lightly, as if the world outside had fallen asleep. She told him about her difficult childhood in the countryside, about her mother who died early, about her absent father, and about her silent struggle to maintain her dignity even when her salary wasn't enough. He didn't say much, but he listened to her like he had never listened to anyone else. And in that silence between one sip and the next, their eyes met and remained. She was the one who looked away first, but he didn't back away. He approached her carefully, like someone who recognizes a sanctuary and doesn't want to desecrate it. He touched her face with his fingertips, and she closed her eyes. The kiss came slowly, timidly, as if they both didn't believe what they were doing. But at the same time it carried an urgency that had been pent up for too long. They ended the night in the guest room, where she had never entered as a woman, only as a maid. And there, between expensive sheets and suppressed sighs, she gave more than her body. She gave him the hope that he would be different. In the days that followed, she walked through the wings of the house with her heart racing. His eyes discreetly sought her out. His touches became frequent. The tension grew every time their paths crossed. But instead of making any promises, he kept quiet. He said nothing about that night. He acted as if it were just another experience on his list of excesses. And that killed her inside, because for her it wasn't a coincidence, it was a surrender. She began to avoid him. She changed her schedules, asked other employees to go in her place, tried to hide in the least lit corners of the house. But he found her. He always found her. And when he did, he pulled her towards him as if the world didn't exist, as if his life only fit together when she was around. She gave in, against her own judgment, against what her heart begged. Because despite everything, he was still the only one who saw her as a woman and not as an invisible object in the house. But loving in silence exacts a price, and she began to feel it in her skin, in her soul. With each stolen kiss, she lost a bit of her own voice. With each hidden hug, her dignity was suffocated. And when one night he told her that he couldn't take her to an important social event because of what people would think, she didn't cry. She just smiled with wet eyes, turned her back, and left the room. At that moment, the woman in love began to die, and the wounded woman began to be born. The silence between them began to grow like a crack that no one sees at first, but that over time swallows the entire structure. She still woke up. Early still cleaned every corner of that house with the same care, but something in her gestures was different, more restrained, more automatic. The sparkle in her eyes had disappeared, and, in its place, there was now a shadow, a sadness that she tried to disguise behind her chores. He understood, but he didn't know how to name it. I thought it was just tiredness, stress, some passing irritation, but it was disappointment. It was her heart, retreating in silence, after so many nights waiting for a gesture that never came. And what hurt the most was knowing that he wanted her, but didn't acknowledge her. He touched her body with desire, but never her soul with respect. One night, as she was gathering up the sheets in the guest room where, months before, she had felt what she thought was love, she stopped and looked at herself in the mirror. Her uniform was wrinkled, her face was tired, her hair tied up in a mess. She remembered how he had told her she was beautiful in a way no socialite could ever be. But those were just words, words that came after the touches, never before. Words that didn't back up promises, that didn't come when she was called the cleaning lady by his friends, that didn't defend her when she was invisible in her own presence. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to be called by her name. She wanted him to say, "This is Eleanor," in public, with pride. But he preferred to hide them, as if she were a mistake, as if loving someone like her was a flaw. The other employees began to notice. Some looked at her with pity, others with envy, others with contempt. The whispers came from the hallways, the malicious insinuations, the sidelong glances, and she felt it all like blades on her flesh. But what hurt the most was when the gardener, a man with a hoarse voice and calloused hands like hers, stopped her and said, "Young lady, be careful with people who only want love behind locked doors. That kind of feeling makes the soul rot." She didn't answer, but she took the phrase home and slept with it in her head. And for the first time in a long time she dreamed of freedom, of a life in which she wouldn't have to beg for crumbs of affection. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to immerse himself in his own world. Between meetings, trips and parties, he pretended that everything was fine. But as soon as he met her eyes, something inside him trembled. He tried to convince himself that it was better this way, that exposing their relationship would be a scandal, that she wouldn't understand his world, that it was better to protect her by keeping everything a secret. But in truth, he was the one who was afraid of losing the respect of others, afraid of being judged, afraid of admitting that he had fallen in love with someone who didn't fit into the mold of his universe. And in this fear, he pushed her away. That week, she started leaving the house later. She would stand at the gate, looking at the sky for a few minutes, before walking down the street towards the bus stop. It was as if she was taking one last breath of the air of that place before moving on. He watched her from the window, but he never had the courage to come down and say, "Stay," not as a maid, as a woman. And she She just wanted him to appear down there one day and hold her hand without fear. But that day never came. The morning he showed up with a gold bracelet wrapped in a small blue velvet box, she thought it would erase the silences of the previous night. He held out the gift as if offering an apology, but she just looked at the object with a mixture of sadness and restrained irony. She didn't open the box. She said an almost silent, "Thank you," and went back to folding the sheets she was collecting from the laundry. He stood there still with the box still open in his hand, waiting for a reaction that never came. He thought he could fix everything with things, with gifts, with one more night between imported linen sheets. But she had already understood. He offered her objects because he didn't have the courage to offer presents, and that for her was no longer enough. At the end of the day, when he tried to touch her again, she recoiled. It was subtle, but it was definitive. She gently removed his hand from her face and said, looking into his eyes, "Alexander, I don't want anything else that doesn't come with your name next to mine. I don't want your body hidden. I want your voice telling me that I'm someone in your life. I want respect. Because love without respect is just a prison with expensive perfume." He tried to laugh, to joke, to deflect, to tell her that she was exaggerating, that they were fine as they were. But she stood firm. For the first time, Eleanor wasn't shaking. And for the first time, he felt fear. Fear of losing her. Because deep down, he knew that she wasn't like the others. She was whole. And he only knew how to love halfway. In the following days, he tried to win her back with small acts of kindness. He sent her discreet notes, left sweets in the kitchen, complimented her hair and clothes, and even made up excuses to be alone with her. But it was too late. Something inside her had broken. And when a tired woman finds the strength to love herself, there is no going back. She was still there in the same house, in the same rhythm, but there was now a wall between them, invisible but insurmountable. She no longer accepted his looks as before. She no longer responded to his touches. And when one day he found her crying in the garden and tried to hug her, she pushed him away. She said in a trembling but firm voice, "If you can't love me in front of the world, why do you think you deserve to touch me in the dark?" He was speechless. For the first time he realized that pretty words were not enough. That presence without courage is absence in disguise, and that she, despite still loving him, was choosing herself. He went back into the house with a lump in his throat and won. Certainty. If he didn't change, he would lose her forever. But changing would require facing his own pride, and he didn't know if he was ready to do that. Meanwhile, Eleanor spent more time looking out the window of the cleaning room. She began to write in a small notebook that she kept at the bottom of her bag. They were letters that would never be sent, outbursts that the world would never read. But there, between those words, she was beginning to stitch together a new version of herself. Version that no longer needed crumbs. A version that little by little learned to exist without him. The following weeks were a silent portrait of the end of everything that had never really been a beginning. Alexander maintained the facade of control, but something in his posture had changed. His shoulders were heavier, his steps were more vague, and his gaze was lost every time he passed her in the hallways. He tried to convince her that there was still time, that they could start over, but she no longer listened with the same ears. It was as if he were only there in body, fulfilling obligations, cleaning corners that he would no longer dirty. Her soul had already departed silently. On a cold Friday, Eleanor felt a strange pain in her chest while changing the sheets in the master bedroom. It was a quick but deep twinge, as if something was trying to warn her that her limit was near. She took a deep breath, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited for the pain to pass. When she stood up, her hands were shaking. She knew it wasn't just her metaphorical heart. It was her physical heart, too, crying out for help. She had been feeling more tired than usual for some time. Dizziness came and went. Her breath was short. But she ignored it, as she always had. After all, who has time to get sick when she has to fight every day to stay on her feet? That same day, Alexander was getting ready to leave. He was going to a conference out of state and wouldn't be back until the weekend. As he passed her in the hall, he gave her a shy wave. She responded with a small, emotionless smile. Inside, she was exhausted. After he left, she went to the pantry, closed the door, and let her tears flow. For the first time, she felt afraid. Not of abandonment, but of dying inside without anyone noticing. When she got home that night, she didn't eat dinner. She sat on the bed and stared at the wall for hours, as if waiting for some answer from the universe. On Saturday morning, she woke up with even more pressure in her chest. She went to the pharmacy, then to the emergency room. The doctor looked at her with concern and ordered tests. The preliminary diagnosis was clear: severe fatigue, high blood pressure, signs that her heart was not well. He told her to rest. He suggested that she should be monitored, but she knew she couldn't stop, not at that moment. She said she would be fine, that she only needed a few days. She took the bus back home, her eyes fixed on the window. Inside, something was beating faintly, but her will to resist was greater. Above all, she wanted to keep him from knowing that he had broken her. On Monday, she didn't go to work. On Tuesday, neither did she. On the third day, the phone rang. It was the housekeeper. Worried, she wanted to know if she was okay. Eleanor answered with a fake smile and said she needed some time, that she was sorting out personal matters. Alexander heard about this in passing, but he didn't call, he didn't text, he didn't ask. Directly, maybe out of pride, maybe out of fear of what he would hear, maybe out of cowardice. But what he didn't know was that his time was running out. She spent the next few days at home, her body resting and her mind at war. He wrote letters that he burned soon after. He relived memories that he tried to bury, and deep down a part of her still waited. She still wished he would show up, without luxury, without excuses, only with the truth. But the days passed, and the silence hurt more than any answer. At the end of that week, Elena tried to get back to her routine. Even though her body was weaker, she decided she needed to go out, breathe fresh air, pretend that everything was okay. She put on her favorite blouse, put on a light lipstick, and went to the neighborhood market, where the noise of the stalls and the smell of ripe fruit distracted her from the pain. She was walking slowly, avoiding crowds, when she felt that sharp pain in her chest again. She had to hold on to a vegetable stall to keep from falling. The vendor, a woman she knew by sight, offered her water and a chair. Elena thanked her and smiled kindly, but deep down she knew that this was not just any discomfort. It was the final warning. And when the pain went away, she didn't go home. She went straight to the health center. I wanted to understand what was happening before it was too late. After further tests, the diagnosis came with the coldness of someone who doesn't mince words. Her heart was compromised. The doctor looked at her seriously and said that her body was taking its toll for all the years she had lived, ignoring her own limits. Prolonged stress, sleepless nights, chronic sadness, a deadly combination. You need to prioritize yourself, Elena, or you'll slowly fade away. She broke down right there in the office. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry without hiding, and in that cry, there was more than fear. There was the pain of years swallowed up, of loves lived half-heartedly, of not having been enough for someone she had given everything she had to. In the following days, she began a simple but decisive treatment: medication, rest, frequent checkups. She had to stop working. With the little reserve she had, she began to eat better, sleep more, read books, and write in silence. The physical pain began to ease, but the emotional emptiness still haunted her. At night, I would look at the dark ceiling and think about him. I wondered if he missed her, if he even knew she was sick, if at some point her name had crossed the cold sheets of that giant house. But no message came, no visit, no call. Alexander, on the other hand, was growing increasingly restless. His attempts to contact him failed. He learned from the housekeeper that Elena was away for health reasons, but he avoided asking any further questions. He covered up his discomfort by saying that it wasn't his problem, but it was, and he knew it. At home, everything seemed the same, but something was missing. The smell of lovingly brewed coffee, the meticulously cleaned mirrors. Her absence made everything meaningless. He began to work more, to go out more, to try to fill the void with appointments and empty dinners. But deep down, he knew that nothing could fill the space she had left. One sleepless night, rummaging through random drawers, he found a folded sheet of paper at the bottom of a box. It was a forgotten piece of paper, scribbled on by her. On it, a sentence written in firm handwriting. Maybe love is just this, continuing even when the other person gives up. He read and reread it. He sat for hours, not knowing what to do with it. He felt the weight of his own silence, the delay in his own decisions. For the first time, he understood that pride kills more love than distance. That morning he decided to look for her for real, not out of pity, not because he missed her, but because, finally, he understood that if he didn't see her again, his world would lose. The last trace of truth that remained. The next morning, Alexander got in his car and drove without warning, without texting, without making excuses. He just went. Her address was still in his contacts, although he had never had the courage to use it before. The street was simple, quiet, with old trees and sidewalks worn by time. When he parked in front of the house, he felt something in his chest that he didn't recognize. Shame. Not because of the difference between their worlds, but because he had never set foot there before, because he had never made a point of getting to know the place where she existed, when she wasn't cleaning up the traces of his life. He knocked on the door. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. He tried to look out the window, but the curtains were closed. He decided to wait in the car. 20 minutes. 30. An hour. Until a neighbor passed by and recognized him. He was famous. He had been in magazines. She looked at him suspiciously and asked, "Are you looking for Elena?" He nodded. The woman crossed her arms and replied, "She's sick. In the hospital. Alone. But don't ask me anything else because now you're too late." The words hit him hard. Hospital. Alone. Too late. Alexander swallowed hard, thanked her, got in his car and sped off to the hospital she had mentioned. When he got there, he had to deal with the embarrassment of not being family. He couldn't go in. He couldn't see her. He couldn't even ask her much. It was then that he heard a nurse at the counter say that she had left written instructions. If he comes, don't let him in. If he asks, tell him I'm fine even if I'm not. And that hurt more than any closed door. He left the hospital like a ghost. The world spun around him, but he couldn't feel the ground. For the first time he experienced rejection, not as punishment, but as a consequence. He had hurt her with his silence, with his omission, with his cowardice. And now she was pushing him away not out of revenge, but out of dignity. Because her love was so great that she preferred to die in silence rather than continue to be humiliated in small daily doses. That night, he didn't go home. He stayed in a cheap hotel near the hospital, as if he wanted to experience a little of the simplicity of her life. He didn't sleep. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, reliving every word he didn't say, every gesture he never had the courage to make. He remembered the first time she said she dreamed of a love that was light. That wasn't hidden, and instead of giving her wings, he kept her captive. The next day he tried to talk to the infirmary again. He left flowers. He wrote a letter. He didn't sign it. He just wrote, "To the woman who saw a man in me, before I even learned how to be one." But she refused. She said she didn't want visitors, or gifts, or flowers. She just wanted peace. He left there with his heart in tatters. It was no longer about winning her over. It was about not knowing how to repair what he had destroyed. He returned to the empty mansion. He walked through the rooms and everything seemed to echo her name. The rooms were too clean. The objects were still. The mirrors were soulless. That house was not a home. It was just a stage where he acted out his power and hid his weakness. He sat on the sofa, stared into the silence and cried. Not like someone who misses someone, but like someone who understood, too late, what he had lost. The days passed slowly, as if time had dragged on. Purpose so that he could feel minute by minute what it was like to live without her. Alexander could no longer pretend to be normal. He cancelled meetings, let his cell phone ring without answering, declined invitations from friends, and ignored the world outside. The only thing he did frequently was walk past the hospital, hoping to see her by chance, perhaps going out to get some sun or picking up something at the reception. But she never showed up, and he was never allowed in. He began, leaving little notes at the reception, signing them with just his initial, as if that would ease the weight of his absence. "If only I had told you how I felt before," or "I miss you even in the things I didn't realize you did." But none of them received a reply, and the lack of a reply said more than any letter written in expensive ink. At home, everything seemed to scream. The smells, the objects, the guest room that was never used again. He began to live in the rooms she frequented most, as if hoping to absorb some memory, some trace, some vestige of the presence that now avoided him. One day, he found her notebook hidden behind a piece of furniture, among cleaning cloths and disposable gloves. He shouldn't have opened it, but he did. And there were fragments of a woman he had never had the courage to know in her entirety, short, painful, honest sentences. "Today he passed by me and didn't even notice. I'm tired of being loved in silence. I wanted him to introduce me by my name." He read each page with his soul bleeding. It was like being forced to finally see the truth that he had avoided out of pride. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Eleanor was starting to pick up the pieces. Her treatment was progressing well, and as her health began to stabilize, emotional clarity began to emerge. During her days of rest, she rediscovered a version of herself that she had forgotten, the woman who wrote, who dreamed, who believed she could be more than what other people saw. She began to write down reflections on her experience, on love, on absence, on the value of silence. Friends began to visit her and suggested that she share her words. One of them took the content to a small publisher that specialized in women's chronicles and true stories, and there, without any pretense, the idea for the book was born. She no longer thought of him the same way. There was no hate, no resentment. There was only the kind of longing that teaches, the kind that shows us what we deserve, not what we have lost. And although her heart still ached from time to time, it was no longer because she wanted to go back. It was because of everything she had allowed to remain silent while she loved. She decided that from then on, she would no longer hide. Not for love, not for fear, not for anyone. And Alexander? He began to read each entry in the notebook as if they were letters to him. And maybe they were. Or maybe they were letters she wrote to herself, to remind herself to never again love someone who didn't see her whole. But what he didn't know yet was that those words that hurt him so much were about to become public. And when that happened, there would be no more pretending that she was just the woman who cleaned the house. Because the whole world would get to know the woman who, even though she loved in silence, had the courage to leave. Time, which had previously seemed frozen to Alexander, began to run cruelly after he saw the first news item. It was a small article in the city's cultural newspaper talking about the launch of a book written by a former domestic worker, whose texts were moving readers with the painful simplicity of someone who experienced a forbidden and unrequited love in public. The title caught his attention, "The Words I Never Said Out Loud," and the author, Elena S. There was no last name, just the initial, but he knew right away. He felt it in his body. It was her. He went to the bookstore that same day. Disguised, wearing a cap and sunglasses, he asked for the book without knowing for sure if he really wanted to read it. But he read it, all of it, that same night, alone, on the same couch where he had so often imagined she would return. The pages were like daggers. Each sentence seemed written with the ink he had spilled over the months he had been silent. It spoke of the loneliness of being loved only between walls, of the pain of waiting for a gesture that never came, of the dignity suffocated by silence. But it also spoke of healing, of the moment she chose herself, even when everything inside her still cried out for his touch. When he finished, Alexander cried like he hadn't cried since childhood, and there, between sobs and the bitter taste of regret, he knew for sure, she was everything he wanted but had never had the courage to admit. The next day, He went back to the bookstore and bought all the copies that were available. She made sure to leave a note with the manager, asking him to send flowers to the author with the words, "Thank you for writing what I never knew how to say." He didn't sign it. He didn't want her to think that this was just another attempt to get closer. He just wanted her to know that he had read it and understood. On the other side, Elena received the gift with a racing heart. She knew who it was. She knew why. But she didn't answer. It wasn't revenge. It was preservation. He had already given her all the words, all the chances, all the love. Now it was time to give yourself what you had always sought from him, appreciation. With the release of the book, recognition also came. Interviews, invitations, messages from other women who saw themselves in her story. Not because they had loved millionaires, but because they had also been silenced, hidden, diminished. And for the first time, Eleanor didn't feel alone. She was surrounded by voices that, together, echoed her truth. She began to speak, to write more, to live with the lightness of someone who has survived an emotional hurricane and still decided to love life. And every time she went on stage, she looked at the audience with the steady eyes of someone who has recovered. She never mentioned names. She never accused. She just narrated, with delicacy, with strength, with truth. And that hurt Alexander more than any direct attack, because now he knew. He had lost to himself, to his own fear, to his own cowardice. One night, while watching one of her interviews on television, he saw her being asked about that invisible man from the book. She smiled serenely and answered, "He was my most painful mirror. He taught me everything I no longer want to accept in the name of love." The interviewer fell silent. The audience applauded, and he just turned off the TV, took a deep breath, and stared at the emptiness of the room where she had never really slept. That night, after turning off the television, Alexander stood in the darkness of his own room for long minutes, as if waiting for some memory of her to emerge on the walls, on the cushions, on the curtain that she used to fix without his asking. But everything was still. Time had done its work. It had erased Elena's presence from the house, but not from within him. And what was left now was an echo, the sound of what could have been and never was. The next day, he cancelled yet another business trip and decided to wander around the city aimlessly, trying to find some respite away from the luxury that had once protected him and now suffocated him. He ended up in a local bookstore, one of those that sell used, marked-up books that smell of history. As he walked through the narrow aisles, an employee recognized him. She approached cautiously and said quietly, "She came by here, you know. She signed some books. One of them is over there." He didn't answer. He just walked to where she pointed. He picked up the book with trembling hands. On the title page, a simple dedication. To women who understood that loving themselves is not selfishness, it is survival. For a second he wanted to take the book, but he couldn't. He already had them all. He decided to leave that one there as a message for someone who still had time to learn. Meanwhile, Eleanor followed her new path with firm steps. She participated in events, wrote new texts, received letters from readers with stories as hard as hers. Some said they left toxic relationships after reading her book. Others said they rediscovered their faith, their voice, their self-esteem. And this gave her a purpose she never had. She was no longer just a woman who cleaned houses. She was someone who cleaned wounds with words, who swept the dark corners of the soul with courage, who washed away pain with truth. One day she was invited to an important literary event. She was to be honored as a new author. The event was to take place in a luxurious theater, exactly the kind of place she would never have dared to set foot in before, if it weren't for working behind the scenes. She dressed with discreet elegance, her hair tied up delicately and her makeup lightly. When she went up on stage to receive the award, she saw a familiar figure in the audience. He was there, alone, in the back, standing against the wall. He didn't try to get closer. He didn't smile. He just watched her with eyes full of everything he had never been able to say. She felt her heart race, but she didn't hesitate. She took the trophy, thanked everyone, and spoke about the power of words, the importance of respecting yourself, listening to yourself and saving yourself. She didn't mention names. She didn't expose anyone. But she left a phrase hanging in the air that made Alexander close his eyes tightly. Sometimes we need to lose ourselves in others to find ourselves again. When the event was over, he left without speaking to her. He knew there was nothing more to say. The time for words had passed. What was left now was to learn from silence. He returned home, entered the mansion, and for the first time in years decided to open all the windows. He let the wind in. He let the dust out. And as he walked through the hallways, he understood that this was not just a cleaning of the space. It was the mourning of someone who had loved too late. Days after the event, Eleanor received a letter at her new address. It was a folded sheet of paper with firm handwriting, but no return address. When she opened it, she recognized the writing. She knew. It was from him. The first lines were read with a tightness in her chest, not from longing but from an old regret that no longer hurt as much as before. Alexander did not apologize directly. He confessed that he did not know how to love, that he grew up surrounded by masks and walls so high that they did not even allow him to see himself. He said that she was the first true reflection he had seen in his life, and that was why he was afraid. You showed me a man I did not know I was, and at the same time, you made me see that I was never enough to deserve you the way you deserved. She finished reading, closed her eyes, and remained silent for long minutes. There was no pain in her heart, but there was also no more room for what had happened. That love had shaped her, yes, but it was no longer part of who she had become. She put the letter in a box along with other memories that she no longer intended to open. Not as revenge, but as closure. A worthy end to a story that, despite the pain, had made her blossom. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to try to relearn life. He began to work less, sell properties, and get involved in social projects discreetly, as if he were trying to somehow give back to the world a little of what he had taken. But none of this was to impress her. It was so that he would stop being the man who hid behind fear. He began to walk the streets without a driver, without rushing. He visited ordinary places, the market, the square, the theater, as if he were trying to touch the things she had always experienced and he had ignored. On a cloudy afternoon, he stopped in front of the same mansion where it all began. The gates were rusty, the garden was poorly maintained. It was as if the house had also felt her absence. He entered slowly, walked through the rooms, and stopped at the mirror in the main hall, the one she cleaned so carefully. His reflection stared back at him like never before. Older, simpler, more real. And there he understood. Love was not what he felt for her. It was what she felt for him. And he wasted it. Eleanor now taught writing classes at a small community library. She encouraged other women to tell their stories, to free themselves through words. One day, a student asked her if she believed in second loves. Elena smiled and calmly replied, "I believe in new beginnings, but the most beautiful thing is when we learn that sometimes the love of our lives is ourselves." That same night, on the bench in the square where he used to write in silence, he left a flower on the seat. It was white, simple, and had a piece of paper tied with a bow. For those who still don't understand, love doesn't shout. It chooses dignity and leaves in peace. No one knew who placed it. But Alexander, upon finding the flower one morning while walking, stopped, read the note, and not knowing if it was for him, simply nodded with tears in his eyes. It was too late to go back. But there was still time to move on, lightly, even with a scarred heart. Years had passed since Alexander and Eleanor had last been in the same space. Life had gone on, and although they had never exchanged a word again, something invisible kept them connected by silent threads of memory. He, now an almost unrecognizable man, had left behind his positions, companies, and luxuries. He lived discreetly in a simple house in the countryside, surrounded by books, gardens, and an elderly dog named Mary, a name he had chosen unconsciously, perhaps because it reminded him of the sweetness he had lost. Every day I wrote small reflections that I never showed to anyone. I was not a writer. I was just someone trying to understand, in silence, how to undo the knot of regret. Elena, in turn, had become a reference. Her books occupied important shelves, her speeches were cited at conferences, and her face, although not that of a celebrity, was known among women who sought to rebuild themselves. She maintained a simple routine. She continued to attend the same fair walk, embrace small causes, with the same fervor with which she once loved in silence. She had changed, but without losing her roots. One afternoon, while walking through an art gallery in the city, she was surprised by a photography exhibition called Absences. They were images of empty places, a solitary chair, an unmade bed, a half-empty cup. Each image was accompanied by a handwritten note, confessions from people who had lost someone they never had the courage to love properly. She stopped in front of one photo in particular, a fogged-up mirror with a yellow cloth over the corner and the print of a hand still visible. Beside it, the note read, "You cleaned my house, but it was you who saw me. When you stopped seeing me, I saw myself for the first time." She took a step back. She knew that handwriting, that mirror, that truth. It was his. There was no name. There was no signature. But it was him. A shiver ran down her spine. She didn't cry. She just smiled slightly, like someone who recognizes the past and embraces it without needing to touch it again. On her way out, she bought the exhibition catalogue and saw that all the quotes had been provided by an anonymous contributor who went by the name H. She went home in silence. She didn't tell anyone. But that night, for the first time in a long time, she dreamed about him. She dreamed that they were sitting side by side, not saying anything, just looking at the sky. And in the dream, he was holding her hand, without fear, without rushing, without hiding. A few months later, Eleanor received an invitation to participate in a documentary about women who transformed their pain into purpose. She accepted. When the film premiered, among the many moving testimonies, there was a brief sequence of images from the Absences exhibition, and there a male voice narrator read that sentence from the mirror. It was his voice. She closed her eyes as she listened, not out of pain, but out of gratitude. He had found a way to say everything he had kept silent, and even if it was too late for them, it was not too late for others to learn. In the last scene of the documentary, the camera showed Elena walking alone through a field of flowers. In a voiceover, her voice said, "Sometimes the truest love is the one that breaks us, because it reveals who we are when no one applauds, and teaches us that, even if we are invisible, we are whole." There was no dramatic soundtrack. There was no forced reunion, just the image of her moving on, and an empty bench in the background with a white flower on it. And in that silence, there was karma, the symbolic justice of someone who waited for love and found in herself the shelter that the other never had the courage to offer. Because in the end she was remembered, she was respected, and she was loved. By herself, by the world, and, even if belatedly, by him. If this story spoke to you in any way, don't forget to leave your comment. This really helps us to continue bringing stories that touch the heart. Subscribe to the channel right now and activate the bell so you don't miss the next ones, and leave it here in the comments. I also believe in love that redeems itself in silence. Now click on the next video that is already appearing on your screen. The next story may be even stronger than this one. See you there.